Peppa Pig, the twin brother. One evening, Peppa Pig's family was expecting a guest. Daddy Pig's twin brother, Gilbert, was coming to visit for the first time in many years. Daddy Pig often talked about how inseparable they were as children, but Gilbert had moved far away, and they had barely seen each other since. That evening, the doorbell rang. Standing on the doorstep was Gilbert. He looked exactly like Daddy Pig, but something about him was off. His smile was too forced, and his eyes seemed empty. During dinner, he barely spoke, silently observing everyone. His movements were unnatural, as if he was learning how to use utensils for the first time. George hid behind his chair the whole time, and Peppa felt uneasy, though she couldn't explain why. That night, Peppa woke up to a strange creaking sound. In the hallway, in front of the mirror, stood Gilbert. He wasn't just looking at his reflection. His reflection was moving with a slight delay, as if struggling to mimic his movements. At one point, he suddenly turned towards Peppa. In the morning, Mummy Pig seemed worried. Daddy Pig was gone. Gilbert was still in the house, acting as if he had always been there. His voice was muffled at first, but as the hours passed, it started to sound more and more like Daddy Pig's. Throughout the day, he imitated Daddy Pig's habits. He sat with a newspaper, tried to joke, but his laughter was hollow. As evening fell, a muffled voice was heard outside. It sounded like Daddy Pig. He was calling for help. Peppa rushed to the door, but Gilbert was already there. He looked at her and slowly smiled. At that moment it became clear. Daddy Pig wasn't coming back. Gilbert had already taken his place. The vanished house. One morning, Peppa and her family woke up in their usual home. Daddy Pig was warming up breakfast, Mummy Pig was making tea, and George was playing with his toys. Everything was calm, but when Peppa decided to step outside, she noticed something strange. Outside the window, there was no familiar green yard, and the sky looked dull and gray. Peppa went to the door and opened it. There was no sound, no people, just darkness. The yard was gone, and the house itself seemed to be surrounded by a dark, endless space. The walls of the house began to slowly disappear, as if dissolving into the air. Peppa tried to return inside, but the door slammed shut, and everything inside turned dark. She screamed and ran back to her parents, but they were sitting as if nothing had happened. Daddy Pig was still reading the newspaper, and Mummy Pig was still making tea. Peppa tried to tell them what had happened outside, but they didn't hear her. Then Peppa noticed that everyone in the house seemed strange. Daddy Pig no longer laughed, and Mummy Pig wasn't smiling. In search of answers, Peppa decided to step outside again. This time, when she stepped out, she found herself in an empty world. Everything around her was gray, with no trees or familiar buildings. Peppa turned around and saw the house she had lived in disappearing, turning into mist. In panic, she rushed back into the house, but now everything inside was as empty and gloomy as it was outside. Mummy and Daddy Pig were sitting in dark corners, their faces strange and lifeless. Then Peppa realized that her house was gone, and perhaps she was too. There were no traces of her family, nothing familiar. Everything had disappeared. Peppa Pig, Richard, has changed. One day, George invited his best friend, Richard Rabbit, over to play at their house. Peppa didn't mind. She was used to their noisy dinosaur games, even if they sometimes annoyed her. At first, everything was normal. George and Richard ran around with their toys, built towers from blocks, and laughed loudly. But soon, Peppa noticed that Richard started acting strangely. He suddenly went silent and began staring at a single spot on the wall. "Richard, what are you doing?" George asked, stepping closer. "He's there," Richard whispered quietly, not taking his eyes off the wall. Peppa tried to ignore it, but the longer Richard stayed, the stranger his behavior became. He stopped playing altogether and sat in the corner of the room, whispering to himself. When Mummy Pig called everyone for dinner, Richard didn't move. I don't want to eat, he said in a flat, emotionless voice. He won't let me. Who's he? Mummy Pig asked, confused, but Richard just shook his head. That night, Peppa woke up to a strange sound. George was still awake, staring at Richard, who was standing in the middle of the room, gazing out the window. Richard, go to bed, Peppa said, but he didn't respond. Suddenly, Richard turned around, and Peppa saw that his eyes looked strangely empty, and his smile was stretched and unnatural. I hear him, Richard whispered. He tells me what to do. George grew scared and hid behind Peppa. Together they went to get their parents, but when they returned to the room, Richard was gone. Where's Richard? George asked, trembling. They searched the house and found him in the living room. He was standing in front of the mirror, but his reflection wasn't moving the same way he was. I'm not Richard anymore, he said, smiling at his reflection. Daddy Pig and Mummy Pig tried to take Richard home, but he resisted, screaming that he wasn't allowed to leave. When his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rabbit, finally took him away, Peppa's house grew quiet again. But the next morning George started acting strangely. He sat in the corner of the room, whispering to himself while staring at the same spot on the wall where Richard had stared. "Who are you talking to, George?" Peppa asked. "My friend," George replied without looking away. Final scene. Peppa approached George and saw his reflection in the mirror. It was smiling wider than it should have been, and his eyes were just as empty as Richard's had been. A faint whisper echoed in the room. "Now he's my friend,"